Welcome back to My Classic Fords. Tonight we're going to put a wheel bearing on the 2014 Edge. Belongs to my wife. I had it in for a motor vehicle inspection. It needs a right rear wheel bearing. They quoted me at the garage $211 for the part and $97 in labor. This is something that you can do at home in your driveway. I ordered it offline. The wheel bearing is a hub assembly. It was $60. Since I pay myself nothing, you get the idea. I saved myself 240 bucks. Okay, so step one, we're gonna pop the wheel off. So loosen your lug nuts up. Okay, so once you've broke all the lug nuts loose, I just used a breaker bar. I'm gonna jack it up, and I'm just gonna jack it up right on the control arm. So right underneath the coil spring. Once we get it off the ground, you can remove the lug nuts. Once you take these off, you can take your wheel off. Now that the wheel's off, I can show you that this wheel bearing is loud. And it does have some play in it. That's why it was called for MVI. So the next part to change, once you've removed the wheel, is you have to remove the brake caliper. And there's two bolts that we're going to take off. And that takes the caliper and the caliper bracket off. So once we remove the caliper, okay, so I've removed the two bolts from the caliper bracket. They have a 15 millimeter head. I just used a 3/8 ratchet with a 15 millimeter socket. So now we'll be able to remove the caliper. Once that's removed, I'm just gonna tuck it up out of the way. It'll kind of just lay there. If you can't find something to set it on so that it's fairly secure, I suggest you tie it, even with a zip tie or a little piece of wire. If it does fall, it is hard on the flex line. Saying that, if it does fall and the flex line breaks, then it probably should have been replaced anyway. That all said, the caliper is now removed. Next thing to do is to remove the rotor. Sometimes they are able just to pop off. Usually, just give them a couple little whacks with a hammer right here, and it should come right off. Okay, so I give it one little bang with the hammer, and it came loose right away. Our brake rotors are in fantastic shape. The brake pads were in fantastic shape, so we don't need to worry about those. This is your hub, and as you can tell, the wheel bearing itself is very noisy. It did have a little play in it with the wheel on. You can't really feel it right now, but it's very noisy. Definitely needs to be replaced. Now this has 4 bolts in the back side. So we're just going to swing the camera around. These 4 bolts right here are the ones that need to be removed. Now I'm going to mention that this Edge is a front wheel drive only. A rear wheel drive has the same wheel bearing. As you can see here, that's where your axle would actually slide through. They use the same wheel bearing on the front wheel drive as they do the rear wheel drive. Or all-wheel drive, sorry. So you would have a axle nut here that you would have to remove, and you'd have to push the axle through. Other than that, generically they are the same. So what we're going to do now, we're going to remove the 4 bolts that hold the hub on. Okay, so the 4 bolts that were there holding the hub on, we've now removed those. Again, I used the same 15 millimeter socket, 3/8 ratchet I used for the brake caliper. Now, I started beating this back and forth. There's more ways to do this than one, but I wanted to do it with simple hand tools to show that you can do this in your driveway yourself. If I was doing it in my garage, I would put an air chisel right here and I would just push it down through and it would rattle it off. I'd just work it back and forth. They are very stubborn, or they can be. As you see, I've got a fairly large hammer to hit it with. On the new bearing, essentially, this section here is a press fit, so it's in there very snug. So you need to basically pull that wheel bearing off. So how I'm accomplishing that, at first, give it some good whacks back and forth and just see if you can break it free. If you can, fantastic, you're already ahead of me. Right here you can see I just have a slight gap opening up. So I took an old screwdriver that I didn't care too much about and I drove it down in here, just hit the end of it in with a hammer, and then I hit on this side, I hit right here. By doing that, it springs this side out and it doesn't allow that side to go back. Then I remove this, put it on the other side, hit it on this side, and the same thing, it just works it back and forth until it will eventually come off. Very stubborn, but it's a hammer and a screwdriver. So there is definitely more ways to do it, but this is how I chose to do it. So one disadvantage is I did hit the dust shield, which you probably will do. I hit it on this side, so we're gonna have to straighten that. Not the end of the world, but sometimes that stuff happens. As you see, the gap is starting to get bigger. So again, now I got the screwdriver in here. I'm gonna hit on this side. I'll see if I can do it while I'm holding the camera. But basically you're gonna hit right here. And essentially what that does, it doesn't let this side close up. I don't know if you can see that or not, but where are we at? It opens that side. There. So that side here is now open. So take your screwdriver and jam it in on this side. Find a spot you can put it. Jam it down in there as best you can. I apologize because I'm doing this with one hand. I just have a small hammer. Just kind of tap that down in there. That lets that side not close up. Then we'll go back to hitting this side. As you see, that time the screwdriver fell out, but we have a huge gap opening up. So again, we'll put the screwdriver in. Now that that's been tapped in, just again, go back. And as you see, it just kind of works it back and forth. You got to have a little bit of patience. Not be in a hurry. You don't want to hit the sides of the car or anything. You don't need to beat on it absolutely that hard. But there's your wheel bearing, so it's off. That is probably the only part that's going to give you a lot of trouble. But now that that's off, we're just going to put that one back on and do the exact same thing in reverse. So one thing I will mention, if your wheel bearing is still very free like this one is, these are fantastic if you have an old steel wheel, obviously a Ford bolt pattern, bolt it on here, make yourself a plate, either weld it on, bolt it on, whatever, and use it for a garden hose reel or a air hose reel. They work fantastic. And like I said, this one's very free, so that might be what I do with that one later. Okay, so I'm going to clean this up a little bit. I'm going to put that back on, put the bolts back in it, and then we'll look at straightening out this dust shield. All right, so the wheel bearing's back on. When you put these 4 bolts in, thread each one in by hand, start them all, tighten them all up equally, and then finish torquing them down after you got them all in and all snugged up equally. Once that's done, I straightened out my dust shield already. I was able just to manipulate it with my hands. As you see, it's fairly straight now. So now we'll just grab the rotor and put the rotor back on. So that's basically that simple. We're going to take the brake caliper, slide the brake caliper back on, and put the 2 bolts back in that. Okay, our brake caliper was put back on. I tightened down these 2 bolts that were in the caliper bracket. And now, quite simply, we'll put the wheel on, torque it, and we're all set. Okay, so I got the wheel on. The jack's been pulled out. We're pretty much all set. The last step is to grab a torque wrench and torque the wheel. So this is what I used to change my wheel bearing. I used a breaker bar with a 19mm socket for the lug nuts. I used a 3/8 ratchet with a 15mm socket for the brake caliper and the wheel bearing. I used a small hammer, and a very large hammer, and a screwdriver to pull the wheel bearing out of the hub or out of the spindle. Now, if this isn't something that you are comfortable with, I don't suggest doing it. I'm sorry, but I'm not responsible if anything happens to your car. This is just showing you how I did it, how I saved myself some money. If you can do it, great. Hopefully this video showed you a couple little tricks. Hopefully you get something out of it. Take what you can. Thanks again for watching.